It is the winter of 1991. Somewhere beneath Moscow in a buried command bunker, the lights buzz, the ashtrays overflow, and the phones have gone disturbingly quiet. This is not the silence of peace. It is the dead hush of a network that no longer understands the war it is supposedly watching. General Michael Moiseev, chief of the Soviet General Staff, stands over a wall-sized map of Iraq and Kuwait. For months, his officers have plotted every division, every airbase, every missile battery that Moscow helped build for its Iraqi client. On paper, it all made sense. The Iraqi army, the so-called fourth largest in the world, was equipped with the same core of systems that defended the Warsaw Pact T-72 tanks, BMP infantry fighting vehicles, layered surface-to-air missiles, and a doctrine of massed armor and dense air defense. In Soviet thinking, American air power could sting, but it could not decide a war alone. The real fight would come when tanks met tanks, when artillery duels turned the desert into a furnace. The ground war, everyone agreed, would be a long, bloody slog. On the 24th February 1991, that certainty evaporated. The ground campaign that Soviet planners expected to last weeks collapsed in just 100 hours. At first, the reports that filtered into Moscow were dismissed as exaggeration, then as Iraqi panic, then as Western propaganda. But the numbers refused to cooperate. Entire Iraqi divisions were not merely being pushed back, they were disintegrating. Units were surrendering en masse or vanishing from the order of battle in a single night. One intercepted call, captured by a Soviet signals post, took on a near-mythical status in the GRU. A desperate Iraqi corps commander shouted into his radio that his T-72 columns were burning. Not under heavy exchange, not locked in a visible battle line. Just burning in place. Crews were abandoning vehicles without ever seeing who was killing them. He begged Baghdad for instructions. The line ended not with the thud of a bomb, but a piercing electronic screech, and then static. Inside the bunker, the Soviet staff turned to what they trusted most: math. How many sorties, how many tanks, what rates of attrition? Nothing matched experience or even theory. The Americans were executing a vast left-hook maneuver. Hundreds of thousands of troops and thousands of armored vehicles swinging wide through the desert and appearing on Iraq's flank almost out of nowhere. By all Soviet logic, this should have been impossible. Desert at night is featureless. Sandstorms scramble orientation. Deep operations require tight control, timetables, phase lines, and an ocean of radio traffic. Yet American corps had crossed hundreds of kilometers of open desert, in bad weather, in combat formation, and Iraqi sensors had seen almost nothing. To the Soviet eye, it looked less like a maneuver and more like an apparition. If the ground picture was unsettling, the air picture was nightmarish. Iraqi air defenses had been built with Soviet help into a dense, layered shell. Long-range radars, medium-range SAMs like the SA-Civ SA-8, French Roland systems, guns, backup radars. On paper, an American strike package flying into that should have paid dearly. Instead, the system behaved as if someone had found its off switch. Iraqi pilots flying their best aircraft, MiG-29s, MiG-25s, reported that their radar scopes would suddenly wash out into static when American fighters dove to engage. Warning receivers screamed that they had been painted and locked by enemy fire control radar, yet their own screens showed an empty sky. Moments later, missiles they never saw shredded their formations. On the ground, radar operators who had trained for years on Soviet equipment watched their scopes go from cluttered to blank. Central command nodes stopped responding. Sector headquarters that tied the entire web together simply vanished from the network without explanation. From Moscow, the impression was chilling. This was not an air defense system under pressure. It was a nervous system being systematically severed. The most brutal symbol of this new way of war appeared as the Iraqi army began to break. As units retreated from Kuwait City, tens of thousands of soldiers, along with Republican Guard armor and stolen civilian vehicles, funneled north up a 6-lane road toward Basra, Highway 80. They were exhausted, disorganized, and completely exposed. For roughly 10 hours, coalition aircraft attacked the column. This was not Second World War-style area bombing. It was an industrialized slaughter directed with unnerving precision. Individual vehicles were picked off. Convoys were bracketed and then methodically taken apart. When satellite imagery of the aftermath reached Soviet analysts, it stunned even veteran officers. The road no longer looked like infrastructure. It looked like a mass graveyard of metal tanks with turrets blown meters away, trucks fused into the asphalt, vehicles packed bumper to bumper and burned where they stood. Western media called it the highway of death. For the Soviet General Staff, it looked like a demonstration run, proof of concept that someone had figured out how to watch an entire battle space and then harvest it at will. The key question in Moscow changed. No longer, can the Americans fight? Now, what invisible system is letting them see everything, hit anything, and remain effectively untouchable? The Soviet response machine spun up in familiar fashion. Intelligence officers across the Middle East were told to collect anything: wreckage, documents, testimony. Spetsnaz teams slipped into the desert after the ceasefire to gather bits of downed munitions and unexploded ordnance. Surviving Iraqi commanders and Soviet advisors were dragged into secure facilities for long, grinding interrogations. The stories they told did not fit any existing template. Tank officers described dug-in T-72 battalions being dismantled from beyond their effective range, often from directions they could not even see. Pilots talked about trying to fight ghosts, American fighters that somehow knew exactly where they were yet never appeared on targeting scopes. Radar crews recounted entire sectors going blind in an instant, as if their equipment had been rewritten, not just jammed. Within technical bureaus in Moscow, a set of hypotheses began to take shape, each trying to find a single silver bullet. Analysts who knew about the F-117 concluded that something even more exotic must be at work. Perhaps there existed a larger, strategic stealth platform loitering unseen over Iraq, punching precision weapons straight into command bunkers and nerve centers. Signals specialists, confronted with testimonies of radars turning to white noise mid-engagement, theorized about a new generation of electronic warfare. Not just noise jamming, but active intrusion injecting false targets, erasing real ones, maybe even spoofing commands to missile batteries. At the paranoid edges of the conversation, some suggested that the much-discussed Strategic Defense Initiative, the Star Wars program, had in fact secretly produced offensive space-based weapons. Beams or high-energy strikes from orbit that could pluck tanks from their revetments without warning. All of these theories shared one flaw. They hunted for a thing, a plane, a secret weapon, a single piece of hardware that could be copied or countered. The truth was worse. The Americans had not fielded one ghost. They had quietly built an entire invisible architecture around the battlefield. To understand what the Soviets were really seeing in 1991, you have to rewind to a different American trauma: Vietnam. The United States walked out of Southeast Asia with shattered confidence, a conscript army in disarray, and a clear understanding it could not hope to outmass the Warsaw Pact in a conventional slugfest on European soil. If it tried to match tank for tank, gun for gun, it would lose. So over the next 2 decades, while Soviet industry focused on thicker armor, bigger missiles, and more divisions, parts of the American defense establishment asked a different question. What if the decisive advantage is not more steel, but better information? Out of that question emerged a triad of goals. 1. See the battlefield more clearly than the enemy. 2. Blind and confuse the enemy's own perception. 3. Move and strike faster than the enemy can process events. By the time Iraqi forces crossed into Kuwait in 1990, the pieces of this approach had matured quietly in laboratories, think tanks, and black programs. The Gulf War was the first time they were all plugged into one another at full scale. At the core of this revolution was something that did not look like a weapon at all. Soviet doctrine was built on maps, compasses, and carefully prepared plans. American engineers, working through DARPA and related programs, had been attacking a different problem since the 1970s: synchronization. How do you make thousands of units move with the coordination of a single organism across hundreds of kilometers, in any weather, day or night? The answer was the Global Positioning System. A constellation of satellites, each carrying atomic clocks, continuously broadcast precise timing signals. A receiver on the ground, by comparing the arrival times of those signals, could compute its exact position on Earth to within a few meters. For an individual soldier or tank commander, this meant something almost miraculous no matter where you were. The middle of a featureless desert, the dead of night, a sandstorm. You could know exactly where you stood and where your next waypoint lay. For a corps commander planning a sweeping hook through open terrain, it meant something much more profound. You could move entire armored formations at full speed in conditions that would previously have forced a crawl, and you could keep units aligned with one another without endless radio chatter or visual references. The left hook that perplexed Soviet analysts was guided not by heroic navigation with paper maps but by a quiet, constant stream of precise positional data from orbit. American armor was not wandering through the desert. It was being pulled along invisible rails defined by satellite signals. But knowing where one's own forces are only solves half the problem. The other half is tearing out the enemy's nervous system. Here, the much mythologized F-117 stealth fighter played a role, but not as a war-winning bomber that wiped out everything by itself. It functioned as a surgical knife. Designed in the shadows by Lockheed's Skunk Works, the F-117 exchanged aerodynamic grace for radar invisibility. It was slow, carried a small bomb load, and relied heavily on computers to remain controllable. Its strength was not brute power, but the ability to slip through the densest radar envelopes as if it were a background noise. On the opening nights of the air campaign, F-117s flew straight into the heart of Iraq's most heavily defended zones. Their primary targets were not fielded forces but nodes command bunkers, sector operations centers, main radar hubs, communications switches. The idea was simple and brutal. If you decapitate the control structure, the whole air defense web collapses into isolated islands. Each SAM battery, each radar site can still see and shoot, but without central coordination their efficiency plummets. They waste missiles, fire at wrong altitudes, and hesitate at the critical moments. Stealth did not outfight the Iraqi air defense network. It crept past its sensors, cut the cables, and left the rest of the force to pick through the ruins. That explained why Iraqi radar operators watched their screens go quiet and why MiG pilots suddenly felt alone in an empty sky. But it still did not answer the question that haunted Soviet tank experts: how entire armored units were methodically plucked, apart from beyond their own range. For that you need to look at the airborne platforms with no guns at all. The ugliest, least glamorous aircraft in this story may be the most terrifying. Take a stretched airliner fuselage, bolt a massive canoe-shaped radar housing under its belly, fill the cabin with consoles and operators, and you get the E-8 JSTARS, Joint Surveillance Target Attack Radar System. What that technical mouthful hides is a simple idea. Put a powerful sideways-looking radar high in the sky and let it stare at a huge area of ground. Process the returns so you can not only map terrain, but also distinguish and track moving objects. Tanks, trucks, artillery batteries in motion, over tens of thousands of square kilometers. From safe orbits far behind the front lines, Joint STARS crews could watch, in near real time, as Iraqi armored battalions started engines, shifted formations, or tried to redeploy. High-value columns showed up as strings of moving dots sliding along road networks or across the open desert. The crucial detail is what happened to that information. It was not written into reports, handed up a chain of command, and acted on days later. It was pushed digitally across data links to other airborne command centers and strike platforms. Way to AWACE aircraft that managed the overall air picture, to fighter bombers capable of dropping precision munitions, but to attack helicopters lurking low behind terrain, waiting for coordinates. Joint STARS did not just see. It decided who should kill what, when, and then pushed that decision out at electronic speed. On Highway 80, once the retreating column was identified and classified, the system became a conveyor belt. Strike aircraft did not waste time searching. Targets appeared on their displays already approved and prioritized. Pilots flew a loop, took a batch of targets, released weapons, and cycled back while the network queued up the next set. To someone used to an analog war, where commanders depend on delayed human reports and paper overlays, this looked like dark magic. To the engineers who had built it, it was simply what happened when you network sensors, decision makers, and shooters into one system of systems. But for tank crews, the most terrifying embodiment of that system was the AH-64 Apache. On its own, it was already a formidable machine armored, night-capable, bristling with sensors and weapons. But its true power lay in how it interfaced with the network above it. The Apache's nose carried an advanced sensor turret, thermal imagers paired with a laser designator. The crew could scan the darkness for heat signatures, mark targets with invisible laser light, and guide missiles onto them. Link that helicopter to data from Joint STARS and Apache, and something new emerges. An Apache could sit masked behind a dune, never exposing itself visually, and still receive precise coordinates of Iraqi tanks over the horizon. The crew did not need to hunt, in the traditional sense. They could simply slave their sight to the location data they were fed, confirm the presence of targets in infrared, and launch Hellfire missiles in top attack profiles that exploited the thinnest armor on a T-72, its roof. From the perspective of the Iraqi crews, what happened felt supernatural. They saw no enemy hulls. Perhaps they caught a distant, fleeting glow in their peripheral vision. Then, in an instant, a deafening flash and overpressure as a penetrator jet erupted inside their compartment, followed by the ammunition carousel cooking off and tossing the turret aside like a toy. A Soviet colonel, trained on the strengths and limitations of his own tank fleets, found this almost physically offensive. The engagement ranges he heard, 4-5 kilometers at night, in bad conditions, defied the parameters he had spent a career teaching. In his schema, the effective reach of a T-72's gun defined the geometry of a tank battle. Here, the killing was happening from beyond that geometry altogether. What he could not yet fully see was that range was no longer just about ballistics. It was about information who could find, classify, and fire on whom first, even when neither side could see the other with naked eyes. In the months after the ceasefire, the Soviet investigation hardened into something more formal. Inside institutions like the 4th Scientific Research Institute of the Ministry of Defense, specialists sifted through satellite images, intercepts, captured hardware, and debriefing transcripts. Gradually, A mosaic came together. First, they grasped that what the West had dubbed Star Wars was not in practice a space shield against missiles, but a much more prosaic and more dangerous achievement in mature, operational satellite navigation and communication architecture. The real strategic space weapon was GPS and the associated network that allowed land, sea, air, and space assets to share a common, precise picture of the battle space. Second, they recognized the role of airborne command and control platforms like AWS and JSTARS, not as super radars in isolation, but as airborne generals with real-time vision. Instead of decisions percolating slowly down from a bunker, the general now flew above the battlefield, directly tasking shooters based on a constantly updated picture. Third, they understood that the American advantage did not rest on any single wonderwaff. The F-15 Eagle, the B-52 bomber, the basic Abrams hull, all were products of earlier decades. Plugged into the new network, however, these old platforms performed in ways their designers had never originally imagined. The phrase that began to appear in internal jargon was reconnaissance strike complex, and later, in broader Russian discourse, revolution in military affairs. It was an attempt to name something larger than a weapons and ecosystem in which sensors, processing communications, and munitions fused into a coherent whole. For Soviet marshals who had grown up equating military strength with the visible, columns on parade, missile silos, tonnage of steel, this realization was devastating. They had prepared obsessively for the wrong kind of war. By the time the diagnosis was clear, the rush to improvise countermeasures had already begun. Engineers dusted off low-frequency radar designs, reasoning that longer wavelengths might at least reveal the presence of stealth aircraft as fuzzy blobs. The hope was to cue more precise missile systems into those general areas and fire into a large probability box. In practice, this jury-rigged chain was too slow and too imprecise to be reliable against elusive, fast-moving targets. The vulnerability of T-72s to top-attack munitions triggered frantic efforts to layer more protection onto existing hulls, blocks of explosive reactive armor, improved passive arrays, anything that might disrupt a descending shaped charge jet. These additions made tanks heavier and more cumbersome without solving the underlying asymmetry. The enemy could see and engage from beyond visual and often beyond sensor range, while Soviet-designed armor remained effectively blind. Realizing that GPS underpinned American navigation and timing, electronic warfare units developed powerful jammers intended to flood the relevant frequencies with noise. While such systems could locally degrade accuracy, they could not erase the redundancy built into Western navigation solutions, which combined GPS with inertial platforms and increasingly other aids. Moreover, wide area, high-power jamming made the emitters themselves lucrative targets in a network that excelled at detecting and destroying sources of interference. Each of these efforts treated a symptom, not the disease. They tried to bolt new patches onto a doctrinal and technological architecture that had been designed for a different era. Ultimately, the grim verdict came in the only language the Soviet General Staff truly trusted: statistics. The ground war's duration, roughly 100 hours, mocked all prior expectations about how long it should take to break an army of that size. At air-to-air kill ratios in the Gulf, with dozens of Iraqi aircraft shot down against effectively no coalition fighter losses in dogfights, underscored that Soviet export-grade jets and training could not compensate for Western situational awareness and missile technology. Estimates of Iraqi armored losses ran into the thousands, while American formations lost only a few dozen main battle tanks in theater, and almost none to direct enemy tank fire. Behind those numbers hid harsher truths. Soviet-designed tanks that had once been envisioned as spearheads into Western Europe turned out to be catastrophically vulnerable when facing opponents who could see first, decide first, and fire from angles and ranges outside their design envelope. The prized doctrine of massed armor and layered air defense looked, in the light of 1991, less like a hammer and more like a brittle sculpture, intimidating in parades, fragile when struck by a flexible, information-rich opponent. There was one more insight buried in the classified assessments that was as political as it was military. For decades, Soviet intelligence had excelled at stealing blueprints and hardware. From bombers to nuclear weapons to computers, the USSR had often narrowed technological gaps by reverse engineering Western designs. The defense industry was an enormous, brutally effective copier. The Gulf War exposed the limit of that model. You can copy an aircraft, you can copy a missile. What you cannot easily copy is a culture of decentralized innovation, a web of software, microelectronics, open-ended research institutions, and doctrinal experimentation that slowly births a networked way of war. The American advantage in 1991 did not rest solely in visible platforms. It rested in the invisible layers: microprocessors in fire control systems, robust digital communications, flexible command philosophies that pushed decision-making down the chain, and a civilian tech sector that continually refreshed the military's information backbone. The Soviet system, rigid and centrally planned, lagged badly in high-end computing, microchip fabrication, and complex software. Its armed forces marched into the late 20th century with some of the heaviest, loudest, most imposing analog tools on Earth, only to find themselves up against a foe that had quietly wired the battlefield into a digital nervous system. By the summer of 1991, when final assessments of the Gulf War landed on the desks of the Soviet leadership, the Union itself was already cracking. Those reports did not topple the Soviet state alone. Economic stagnation, political decay, and national unrest were doing that work. But they delivered a brutal metaphor, an empire that had poured a staggering share of its resources into the promise of military strength discovered, almost overnight, that its chosen path of strength had led to obsolescence. The nightmare that haunted generations of Soviet planners. A sudden, decisive Western blow had always been imagined in the form of fleets of bombers or a blizzard of nuclear warheads. When it finally arrived, it looked like something else entirely: a precise, quiet pulse from satellites. A web of data links stitching aircraft, tanks, ships, and command posts into a single organism. A war in which the decisive weapons were not just shells and rockets, but clocks, chips, and code. In that sense, the highway of death was more than a battlefield atrocity or a media spectacle. It was a brutal, flaming illustration of an idea that in the late 20th century, the side that understands, shares, and acts on information fastest does not just win firefights, it makes entire opposing force structures conceptually obsolete. The Soviet Union, built on secrecy, hierarchy, and the control of information, was never going to win that contest. Long before the red flag came down over the Kremlin, its army had already lost the last war it had truly prepared to fight, the one where steel mattered more than signals.